So a little bit of background. Minnesota's Next Generation Energy Act of 2007 requires 1.5% annual energy savings per year. And that's a statewide goal, and it gets allocated out to utilities and state entities. So some utilities have a little higher than that, some utilities have a little lower, but that's the statewide goal. Minnesota's Office of Energy Security contracted with Minnesota Environmental Initiative, which is now just Environmental Initiative, to facilitate a stakeholder process to look for ways to achieve this 1.5%. And the four areas were utility infrastructure, low-income conservation, behaviorals, and codes and standards. Wide range of participants, chambers of commerce, utilities, environmental and energy NGOs, BOMA, state departments, and the full list of recommendations is available at the website listed here, environmentalinitiative.org. Basically, we have a state energy code, and most states do, and we think that we're using more energy than the code would require. We don't actually know because most states haven't ever measured. But when you haven't checked if somebody's complied, I mean, how many of you have that street near your house that you know there are never cops on and you might go a little over the speed limit? Why would we expect the human behavior of other people in their professions to be any different than when we're driving around? So we think there's a gap between practice and what the current code is, which actually gets back to what Adam was saying of even if we don't have full compliance later on, if we have a gap now, that makes that potential savings even higher because there's more of a delta from where we are to where we could be if we adopted more stringent codes. As codes get more and more stringent, that gap's going to grow if we don't do anything. So the Minnesota Environmental Initiative effort was looking at what could we do to reduce that gap and measure what that gap actually is. So the Department of Energy, via PNNL, has come up with a method for measuring state energy code compliance. And it breaks buildings into four categories. You have new commercial, renovated commercial, new residential, and renovated residential. And you're required to survey 44 buildings in each of these categories. From this, you calculate a mean compliance score. A proportioned weighted mean compliance score. You do a checklist, and you figure out was the wall insulation enough? Was the, all of the different items in the code that we talked about earlier today. And that checklist is based on those four categories and the building type. Now, so you come up with a number such as 82%. A proportional weighted mean compliance score is really, really helpful if you want to compare yourself to other proportional weighted mean compliance scores. But I find it difficult to compare that to a new power plant, a CFL program, other investment opportunities to reduce our energy consumption. I'm an engineer. My brain only goes so abstract before I start getting the air gets too thin, and I start getting like, I need a little, down-to-earth kilowatt hours and therms. So what we've done is we've proposed a way to turn this into kilowatt hours and therms, and look at how much energy that is. When we do that, we can compare it to other DSM programs. It's the big impact. So perhaps we're only 50% compliant, but if that's a small amount of kilowatt hours and therms, we're better off spending our time, money, and political capital somewhere else. On the other hand, if we're 5% non-compliant, but that's a large amount of energy, let's focus on that. I mean, we need to be able to compare apples to apples. We need to be able to break it down to actual energy consumption. So how would you do that? What we've proposed, and this is the MEI recommendation to the state is evaluating that and making decisions on how to move forward. So that's where we are status-wise. The first thing would be to quantify the new and renovated buildings across the state. How many are there? What types of building and what are the building sizes? So this would take a survey of what construction permits were issued, Dodge reports, create the widest database of the number of buildings. Inherently, you're going to miss some, which is actually beneficial because it gives it a slightly conservative bias to the analysis. So, because if you only find 95% of the buildings, your proportional savings calculation is actually a little low. Once you've quantified the number of buildings, calculate the energy consumption of those buildings at code level. So how many kilowatt hours and how many therms would a typical office building or use at code level with that fleet of buildings that you have? And I could get really nerdy on how you do that and break that out, but I'll spare you. The next step would to look at the values in the survey. So when you've done that survey, you know that office buildings typically put in R9 walls instead of R13 walls. Well, how much energy does the fleet of office buildings use with that amount of energy, with that property, compared to an R13? By doing it for all of the survey, you'll see where the fleet of buildings that was actually built compares to a code level fleet of buildings. But then there's a third step to calculate just the non-compliant attributes. So we would anticipate that some attributes are beyond code. Furnaces tend to be 90% efficient in Minnesota for a variety of reasons, and so we'd expect that to be there, but perhaps other features are non-compliant generally. So by having these two, you'll know both where you fall compared to a code level stock of buildings, but also what your opportunity is if you brought everything up to minimum compliance. So if everybody met the prescriptive method, how much energy would you save? It's a little different than the previous one where it'd be if everybody met the performance method, how much energy would you save? Attribution-wise, we were recommending two different methods. So you would have statewide efforts that would be funded by the utilities, conservation improvement programs, on a voluntary basis. So utilities would opt in. However much money they contribute, the savings given to them would be distributed proportionally. And for this, what we would be looking at is what is the improvement year over year. So we do the survey 1 year, and then a year or two later we do the survey again. What's the improvement in energy consumption due to increased compliance? These statewide efforts would be mostly educational in nature. Again, nobody anticipates that utilities want to be telling their clients, bad client or bad customer. It's going to be more of a carrot approach, an educational approach. You look at year-over-year savings here. Now, if a utility wanted a region-specific program, so perhaps paying for additional inspections in their utility territory, or a specific education or tools provided in that utility territory, what they could do is pay to have that territory oversampled in the next survey. So you'd need 44 of each of those categories sampled in that territory, and compare that to the statewide average energy consumption. So that way you could participate in both. You could do your region-specific thing, and you could also participate in the statewide and take energy savings from both. In conclusion, with this additional analysis, the hour required code compliance measurement could be used to calculate the energy impact of non-compliance. By calculating that, you can now compare increased compliance efforts with other demand-side management programs. And then the savings could be allocated for year-over-year improvement or territory-over-territory improvement, depending on how the programs were set up. And back to Isaac, and then